The fall of the Roman Empire, and by Roman Empire I mean the Western Roman Empire, is one of the more harshly debated moments of human history. Opinions about it were written even just a century after the fall. So today we're not going to try and provide a definitive answer. What we are going to do is look at the 50 shades of the fall of the Roman Empire. And by 50, I mean 5. 5 reasons historians gave, 5 points of discussion. We are going to provide the reason why people believed the Roman Empire fell because of this or that, and then counter-arguments. Maybe, at the end, you can give me the answer in the comments below. So let's get to work. To begin our journey, let's give some respect to those who came before us. The discussion about the fall of the Roman Empire began as early as the 5th century with Zosimus, a Byzantine historian who wrote the New History, which is notable for its critical view of the later Roman emperors and its emphasis on internal decay. He attributes Rome's downfall not solely to external barbarian pressures, but to what he sees as a corruption of Roman morals and institutions. Zosimus' account is important because it marks one of the earliest examples of a decline and fall narrative, setting the tone for later interpretation. It has to be said that it is interesting how this interpretation is perfectly compatible with the view of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, who thought the costumes and culture of Rome had decayed into an amoral mess ruled only by desire. In the 6th century, Jordanes, in his Getica, presented a history of the Goths that interweaves with the narrative of Rome's collapse. Although focused on the Gothic migration, this text reflects early attempts to explain how these migrations, and Rome's inability to integrate or repel them, contributed to the disintegration of the Western power. Procopius of Caesarea was also in the 6th century. He observed that shifting loyalties and structural weaknesses of the old Roman military system led to the collapse. So as we can see, this topic was heavily discussed with many different interpretations presented, just like an ancient Reddit argument. So as we said, we will go into 5 reasons. Reason number 1, the most obvious reason, barbarian invasions. When people imagine the fall of Rome, they picture a storm of barbarians flooding into the empire. Visigoths marching on Rome, Vandals plundering North Africa, Huns sweeping in like a force of nature. This is the classic explanation, that the Western Roman Empire collapsed under the sheer weight of external invasion. And there is truth to that. Rome did not fall peacefully. The 5th century saw one of the most chaotic and violent migrations in European history, where entire people crossed Rome's border and carved out a new kingdom from its flesh. First of all, to understand the situation, let's lay out an extremely condensed version of what happened. In 376 AD, the Visigoths, fleeing the Huns, required asylum across the Danube frontier. They are allowed to settle in Thrace, but Roman corruption and famine push them to revolt. This leads to the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where Emperor Valens is killed. This marks the first major breach of Roman military dominance in the Balkans. In 406, during the depth of winter, the Rhine freezes over. A confederation of Vandals, Alans and Suebi cross into Gaul, facing minimal Roman resistance. Roman legions had been pulled back to fight usurpers and civil wars. These invaders move westward, devastating Gaul before the Vandals continue south into Hispania and eventually North Africa. In 410, the Visigoths, under King Galaric, sack Rome. Though the city is spared mass destruction, the psychological blow is enormous. The city, which had taken the whole world, was itself taken. In 429, the Vandals, now led by Genseric, cross from Hispania into North Africa, as we said, Rome's grain heartland. By 439, they capture Carthage, establishing a kingdom that will defy Roman reconquest for nearly a century. In 451, The Huns, under Attila, invade Gaul, ravaging the countryside. They are stopped only by a Roman Visigothic coalition, yet Attila, just a year later, invades Italy, forcing Emperor Valentinian III to flee Ravenna, the capital of the Western Empire at the time. Though Attila dies shortly after, the damage to Italy is done. In 476, the Western Roman Empire is formally abolished when the Germanic general Odoacer deposes the teenage Emperor Romulus Augustus. He sends the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, the last bastion of Rome. Now, the argument that Rome fell to invasion is powerful. Never before Rome had faced so many hostile migrations at once from so many directions, by people that could not easily assimilate or could not easily be defeated. The legions were no longer what they once were. Some provinces hadn't paid their troops properly in years, and key frontiers were left nearly undefended. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 is often cited as a turning point. The loss was catastrophic, with between 10,000 and 20,000 Roman soldiers killed. It was called by Ammianus Marcellinus the worst defeat since Hannibal's triumph at Cannae. The battle exposed how brittle the Roman Empire had become militarily, and there never was a true recovery of military resources spent there. By the 5th century, many of the so-called barbarian generals within the Roman army, men like Stilicho, were themselves of Germanic origin. The army was increasingly reliant on federati, allied but autonomous tribal groups who served Rome for land and pay. The sack of Rome of 410, the loss of Carthage in 439, and finally the fall of the Western Court in 476, all seem to point toward an empire that was simply overwhelmed by external forces. Now, as the counter-argument, was this really an invasion in the traditional sense? Or was it something else, a slow absorption, a failure of management, civilizational transformation, we could say? Let's return to the Visigoths in 376. They didn't come as enemies, they were refugees, granted entry by the emperor himself. Their rebellion wasn't ideological, it was a response to perceived exploitation, but especially to the inability of the empire at the time to provide them with the resources they needed to survive. This, of course, was made worse by the fact that corruption was rampant. Food was withheld, children were enslaved, and after the Battle of Adrianople, a new settlement, a new arrangement was found. They settled as federati, and following them, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Ostrogoths, all entered the empire as allies. And one could say that when the empire started to fall apart on a managerial level, they filled the power vacuum. Even during the sack of 410, Alaric's goal was not to destroy the empire by taking Rome. He wanted to be recognized by the emperor as a Roman general. His requests were refused again and again, and after the sack, he moved on to seek lands in Gaul and Hispania, eventually establishing a Romanized kingdom. Later, Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king of Italy, would govern from Ravenna in full Roman fashion, Latin laws, Roman Senate, and imperial coinage. He said the Gothic nation, though different in race, ought to be one with the Roman spirit. So far from obliterating Rome, these barbarian rulers preserved its systems. The Vandal kingdom in Africa maintained Roman taxation. The Visigothic code of law, issued in the 7th century, was written in Latin and heavily modeled on Roman precedent. Even Odoacer, who deposed the last Western emperor, ruled not as a king, but as a patricius, a Roman title, under the nominal authority of the Eastern emperor. Archaeologically, we see continuity. Villas, roads, and towns were repurposed rather than destroyed. Christianity, itself now Roman, spread rapidly among those people, generating an integrated shared cultural and spiritual world. So, of course, while we cannot deny that the barbarian invasions destroyed the Western Roman Empire practically, is this the reason for the fall of the Roman Empire? Let's continue our list. Reason 2. Political instability and civil war. While barbarian invasions may have broken the empire body, political instability shattered its spine. From the 3rd century onward, the Roman Empire was convulsed by relentless internal conflict, often tearing itself apart faster than any external enemy could. By the time Rome was sacked in 410, the Western Roman Empire had endured over a century of almost uninterrupted internal strife. In fact, from the mid-3rd century onward, civil war became so common that peace seemed the exception rather than the rule. The clearest expression of this came during the crisis of the 3rd century, something I really wanna do a video about, by the way. Between 235 and 284, a half-century that saw 26 legitimate emperors, most of whom were assassinated or killed in battle, countless usurpers, some ruling provinces independently for years, and repeated breakdowns of central authority, with Gallic and Palmyrian breakaways from the empire forming in the west and the east respectively. The historian Zosimus put it well. The government changed almost monthly, as did the loyalty of the army, with every general convinced that he could seize the purple being the empire, of course. With each succession crisis, legions were pulled from vital frontiers to support rival claimants. The Rhine and the Danube were stripped of defenders. In 260, the Emperor Valerian was even captured alive by the Persian king Shapur I. This, while not being exactly an expression of civil war, was a degradation of the role of the emperor. He was the first to suffer such a humiliation. So Rome kept dividing and rejoining. We have great emperors like Diocletian and Constantine in the late 3rd and 4th century, putting Humpty Dumpty together again, and immediately, like in 337, after Constantine's death, we have civil war between his sons, that lasts until 361. The final, most ruinous phase began in the 5th century. Between 395 and 476 AD, the West saw 9 emperors and dozens of military strongmen, many of them Germanic federati generals. These men, like Stilicho, ruled over puppet emperors behind the throne. Most never ruled beyond Italy or small parts of Gaul. Some emperors, like Precious Attalus, were installed not by Roman authority but by Gothic warlords like Alaric. Others were children, like Valentinian III, who came to power at 6 years old. All of these rulers spent more time fighting each other rather than the enemy. In 423, civil war broke out between Joannes, the usurper, and Valentinian III, proclaimed by the Eastern Court. In 455, after the assassination of Valentinian, the general Petronius Maximus seized power and lasted only 2 months, before being killed by an angry mob as the Vandals approached Rome. The pattern is clear. Constant civil war had killed the concept of legitimacy in the West, and Rome was ruled by whoever had the loyalty of a few thousand soldiers. Now let's go with the counter-argument. Here's the problem with the civil war theory. Political instability wasn't new to Rome. In fact, Rome had always been politically unstable. It was actually the reason why it was so strong. It was a king of the hill game. From the early republic to the civil wars to the year of the 4 emperor in 69 AD, every civil war had Rome emerged bruised but intact. One could even say that the civil wars were a phenomenon of destructive creation, like a fire burning the corruption from a forest in order for it to breathe again. When Roman institutions became too slow, too old, too traditional, a civil war would create space for things to be reformed, restructured. Like Diocletian and Constantine that we already cited. They improved taxation, re-established centralized authority, The Tetrarchy, dividing the empire into East and West with 2 emperors and 2 junior emperors, was an attempt to institutionalize succession. Moreover, we have to remember that we have 2 Roman empires, the East and the West. So, since the East was not immune from civil wars, why did it not fall? The East had more concentrated wealth, better administrative infrastructure, stronger urban centers like Antioch, Alexandria and Constantinople. It also faced fewer invasions during key moments, allowing it to recover from political chaos more easily. This suggests that civil war was not a fatal illness, but one that required robust systems to endure. As said by historian Brian Ward Perkins, the real tragedy of the Western Empire was not that it was unstable, but that it lost the capacity to recover from instability. And so we delve deeper. And, as we said, the Eastern Empire had a level of economic resistance, of institutional resistance, to all of these corrupting influences we talked about. So let's go into reason number 3. Economic decline and overextension. At its height in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched over 5 million square kilometers, from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the Tigris River in Mesopotamia. It took weeks, sometimes months, to communicate between provinces, and enormous military and administrative resources were needed just to keep the machine functioning. Maintaining this infrastructure required staggering wealth. Roads, grain supplies, harbor repairs, city defenses, imperial ceremonies, frontier garrisons, everything costed money, and lots of it. By the time of the 3rd century, the imperial economy was under severe strain. Let's go into some details. From the reign of Septimius Severus in 193 onward, emperors repeatedly diluted the silver content in coins to stretch their budgets. The denarius, once a silver standard, became nearly worthless by the time of Gallienus in 253. By 268, the denarius contained less than 2% silver. This and other factors contributed to hyperinflation. Prices skyrocketed. In the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301, Diocletian tried to freeze runaway prices, listing over 1,000 goods and services with maximum allowable charges. But it failed almost immediately. Hoarding increased, trade slowed, and black markets thrived. In the meantime, military costs were rising, and as a reaction, so did the taxes. Under Diocletian, tax collectors were tasked with gathering payments in both money and kind, grain, cloth, livestock, and they often used brutal means. Entire classes of people, especially in the countryside, were crushed under the burden of taxation. As time passed, piracy, banditry, and internal strife disrupted the long-distance trade routes that had enriched the empire. Western provinces, in particular, became increasingly isolated, as the geography allowed for more freedom of action for the bandits. After the 3rd century, the once bustling economy of Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia contracted severely. We can see that even in archaeology in London. As urban life declined and coinage disappeared from local circulation. This was finally made worse by cycles of plague, particularly the plague of Cyprian in 249 that lasted until 262, and the Antonine plague from 165 to 180. They devastated the population. Fewer workers meant less production, which meant fewer taxes, which meant heavier load on survivors. On top of this unstable structure was placed military overextension. By the late Empire, maintaining the borders required between 400,000 and 600,000 troops, stationed in often remote and hostile areas that bore few resources back. Hadrian had already recognized this danger in the 2nd century when he abandoned the short-lived conquest of Trajan in Mesopotamia, believing them too costly to defend. Even with Diocletian's reforms and Constantine's re-centralization, the empire structure remained brittle. The Annona system, designed to feed Rome and later Constantinople, relied on massive grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa. Any disruption, whether by Vandal pirates by the 5th century or local rebellion, threatened the food security for millions. The historian Peter Heather summarized this sharply. The empire's fate was determined not in great battles, but in the cumulative failure of a system that had overreached itself. And so, by the 5th century, the Western Empire had neither the money or the manpower to field full legions. Instead, it resorted to recruiting barbarian federates, as we pointed out earlier. Now, for our counter-argument, this all seems very cant and clear, but one has to recognize that the Roman economy was not a monolith destined for collapse, but a complex adaptive system. In many ways, the Eastern Roman Empire experience illustrates the adaptability even as the West suffered. Again, Brian Ward Perkins said, "The real tragedy of the Western Empire was not that it was economically weak, but that it lost the ability to mobilize its resources against multiple converging crises." In a reaction to this crisis that we described, in the West, a barter economy and an economy based on subsistence farming was born, creating a patchwork system that was less dependent on central authority. The decline of monetized commerce was partly offset by the resurgence of localized self-sufficient agriculture. Archaeological findings, such as the continuity of villa lives in Gaul and Hispania, demonstrates that while the centralized economy faltered, local production and trade persisted. Importantly, the simple fact that the barbarian kingdoms we talked about chose to use the old Roman institutions, the administrative skill and structure that was on the ground, means that it was still there. Both Visigoths and Ostrogoths actively adopted the Roman administrative practices, and in many cases they sustained the fiscal mechanisms that had underpinned the empire for centuries. So, if the economy, even in crisis, persisted, can we truly point at it as the reason for the fall? Now, some point at something more ephemeral, something more spiritual, we could say. Reason 4: moral decay and hedonism. For centuries, critics, both ancient and modern, have argued that Rome did not fall solely for the external enemies or economic overreach, but because its citizens lost the very values that had once forged the empire. This theory contends that Rome grew opulent and self-indulgent. Its foundational discipline and civic spirit were gradually replaced by decadence, corruption, and hedonism. In the early days of the Republic, Roman society was built on ideas such as virtus, courage, disciplina, discipline, and a strict sense of civic duty. These virtues were celebrated in the annals of Roman history, forming the backbone of its military might and republican governance. However, as Rome transitioned into an empire and its borders expanded, many contemporary writers began to note a shift in public behavior and elite conduct. The seeds of this argument can be traced back to Sallust, a historian who lived between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, who lamented in his writings that Rome's nobility had grown corrupt and self-serving. He noted that the excessive luxury and the abandonment of traditional values paved the way for internal decay. Later, satirists like Juvenal, late 1st century and early 2nd century AD, mocked the excesses of Roman elite. In his satires, Juvenal famously declared, "Whoever suffers a loss of virtue should be restored by example of an ideal life." With this, he implicitly created a contrast between the disciplined lives of the past and the luxurious excesses of his contemporary society. Now, all of this was a long time before the end of the empire. It was, after all, at the beginning. But by the 3rd and 4th century AD, evidence of decadent living was widespread. Emperors such as Elagabalus and Maximus Thrax, both from the first half of the 3rd century, were notorious for their outrageous behavior, often scandalizing traditionalists with their excesses in personal life and courtly manners. Empress Julia Eudocia in the Eastern Empire and Licinia Eudoxia in the West became symbols of an elite more enamored with pleasures than with statecraft. Archaeological evidence supports these literary critiques. Lavish villas and intricate mosaics found in southern Italy and North Africa illustrate a culture that immensely valued comfort and luxury. In places like Pompeii and Herculanum, before their destruction in 79 AD, scholars have observed a mix of sumptuous domestic art and private leisure spaces that hint at a broader societal trend toward personal indulgence. Later, the monumental public works of early Rome gave way to private extravagance, grand feasts, theatrical spectacles, and a burgeoning culture of entertainment that replaced earlier martial virtues. In the 4th and 5th centuries, figures like Aurelius Victor and Ammianus Marcellinus criticized the loss of Rome's traditional virtues. Aurelius Victor compared the austere republican past unfavorably with the ostentation of the imperial court, while Ammianus observed that when nobles pursued pleasure over public duty, they not only eroded personal honor, but undermined the stability of the state. Salvian of Marseille, writing around 430 AD, condemned the excesses of Roman society by contrasting the indulgent lifestyles of the elite with the destitution of the common people. He argued, "It's not the barbarians alone who bring us low, but the spoils of our own extravagance and the excesses of the mighty." This moral decay was not limited to the elites, though. As luxury became widespread among the middle classes, public institutions, once centered around debate, civic duty and military service, began to reflect a growing preoccupation with personal gain and pleasure. Festivals and games, originally tied to religious and civic traditions, transformed into spectacles of excess. The famous banquets held in the imperial palaces became proverbial for their extravagance. Historical legends, like Romans puking away during banquets to make room for more food, while unfounded as general cultural trends, indicate that people were very ready to believe that something like this was happening, and this has value in itself. It is, after all, always important when trying to understand history to remember that lies or exaggerations or legends are not there to trick you. They can explain even more than a fact can. After all, there is no archaeological evidence of cultural behavior or of an opinion. Now for the counter-argument. These critiques capture, of course, an element of truth. They are not the whole story, though. Many scholars argue that the narrative of moral decay is as much a product of rhetorical exaggeration as it is an objective assessment of Roman society. Much of the evidence for moral decline comes from sources that had a strong agenda. Early moralists and later historians like Edward Gibbon, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, often used decadence as a catch-all explanation to underscore the contrast between Rome's legendary past and its troubled present. Their depiction was intended as a moral lesson rather than precise economic or social analysis. Gibbon himself noted the decay of public virtue is the real and significant cause of the collapse of empires. Yet, subsequent analysis has shown that such assessment can be colored by nostalgia and selective emphasis. In reality, many Roman elites continued to demonstrate remarkable competence and resilience in governance. What differed was their methods. They were different from the austere traditions of the Republic. Archaeological evidence, when viewed in context, does not uniformly support a narrative of widespread decadence. While some regions show signs of luxurious living, others, especially in the countryside and the less urbanized provinces, continue to operate according to older, more austere lifestyles. In many areas, traditional values coexisted with new cultural practices rather than being entirely displaced. Moreover, moral decay cannot be seen in isolation from other factors like economic stress, military overextension, and political strife. For instance, even if some elite indulged in hedonism, this was often a response to the acute pressures they faced from relentless invasions and internal power struggle. Their decline in civic duty may well have been a symptom of deeper structural crisis rather than the primary cause of collapse. When the world around you starts burning and you can't do anything about it, you might as well throw big party. Modern historians, such as Brian Ward Perkins, have argued that the image of Rome as decadently decaying is partly a construct of later historiography, aimed at explaining complex societal changes in simple moral terms. They suggest that while there were instances of excess, the overall picture is far more nuanced. Elite behavior varied wildly, and many rulers continue to embrace civic responsibility even in the middle of all that luxury. And this brings us to our last reason for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And this is a big one, certainly a wildly discussed one. Reason 5. Religious transformation. The conversion of Emperor Constantine the Great in 312 AD and the subsequent adoption of Christianity as the state religion marked a profound shift in the Roman worldview. Critics of this transformation argue that the new faith undermined key pillars of Roman society. Traditional Roman religion was closely intertwined with military ethos. The gods were believed to protect the state and inspire martial valor. As Christianity spread, its message of peace, forgiveness, and spiritual salvation came to be seen by some contemporaries as a departure from the aggressive and honor-bound qualities long celebrated in Roman military culture. Early critics argued that Christian pacifism reduced the willingness of citizens to defend the state fiercely against its enemies. Now, the adoption of Christianity not only introduced a new religious framework, but also reoriented the cultural and social priorities of the empire. Pagan religious practices, with their inherent rituals and civic celebrations, had been a unifying force in Rome. Think of the Pax Deorum, even, the Roman concept of religious peace, because everyone recognized everyone else as gods. Something that of course died with Christianity. This revolution of values is said to have weakened the social glue that held the empire together. Early Christian apologists, like Eusebius, claimed divine intervention in imperial affairs, while traditionalists grumbled about the loss of ancestral rights. Christianity's rise brought with it a new focus on church building and religious patronage, something more physical. Major emperors and wealthy citizens founded the construction of basilicas and monasteries, redirecting resources that might once have been allocated to public works or military defenses. Notably, by the late 4th century, some historians have pointed to an increased emphasis on constructing Christian monuments rather than maintaining the old civic infrastructure. Of course, the transformation was not peaceful. The transition from paganism to Christianity often involved forceful suppression of the old cults. In 391 AD, under Emperor Theodosius I, a series of decrees banned pagan rites and closed temples. This led to cultural and political friction among different segments of the population. The famous pagan reaction of some regions, with intermittent local resistance to Christian rule, underscores the divisive impact of the religious shift. So in the view of those who bring forth this explanation, these changes helped creating a society less focused on the valor of sacrifice necessary to defending the state. Some contemporary critics even linked the rise of Christianity directly to military and political decline, contending that the new priorities sapped Rome of the resilience that had once made it formidable. And now, finally, for the counter-argument. Many historians argue that the religious transformation of the late Roman world was not the destructive force its detractors claim, and that in fact provided new forms of unity and stability. Contrary to the idea that Christianity undermined Roman military spirit, many Christian emperors and generals demonstrated tremendous resolve. Constantine himself, after his conversion, reformed the military and bureaucracy. The Eastern Roman Empire, firmly Christian by the 4th century, maintained a powerful military and a remarkably stable administration for over 1,000 years, suggesting that Christianity was compatible with strong imperial governance. And think of the presence of the bishops on the territory, a new line of defense for the administrative empire. Many aspects of Roman tradition and culture were adapted and integrated into Christian practice. Pagan festivals, for instance, were repurposed into Christian holidays. The moral exhortation of the early Christians often echoed the civic virtues of Rome, emphasizing discipline, charity, and community support. Far from erasing Roman identity, Christianity reshaped it, transforming classical ideas into new forms suited to the changing world. Even on a legal level, the Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, was deeply Roman in its legal structure while reflecting Christian ethics and morality. This legal framework would later influence the entire Western tradition well into the modern era. Modern historians often argue that the transformation brought about by Christianity was not one of decline but of renewal. The faith offered a cohesive identity that transcended the fractured loyalties of Roman provincial life. Through its universal message, Christianity helped to preserve and transmit many aspects of Roman governance, culture, and law, even as political power shifted and the Western Empire, as a centralized institution, fell. So they argue that Rome survived in the churches instead of being destroyed by them. When we speak of the fall of the Roman Empire, we must confront a paradox. On one level, the empire did indeed fall, a dramatic, massive disintegration marked by barbarian invasions, bitter civil wars, crippling economic overextension, moral degradation, and transformative religious revolution. Yet, a closer look reveals that while the Western Roman Empire's centralized political power crumbled, the very elements that had built Rome, laws, traditions, and even cultural identity, continued to thrive in the successor kingdoms and the Eastern Byzantine Empire. The barbarian leaders who once stood at Rome's gates soon adopted its customs. As Theodoric the Great famously insisted, to rule the Romans, one must become Roman. It was through this process of transformation, rather than obliteration, that Rome's legacy endured. There is truth in every single explanation we gave, and yet none of them fully explains how the Roman Empire fell. And why are we so interested in this? It is because we see the Roman Empire everywhere. We look for the reasons of the fall of the Roman Empire to try and explain the world around us, to try and watch the modern empires and see how or why they will fall. And so, at the end of our 50 or 5 shades of the fall of the Roman Empire, we find ourselves not really holding a definitive answer, but understanding that the empire both fell and survived, disintegrated and endured. I hope you enjoyed our historical walk, and please let me know why you think the Roman Empire fell. I'll see you soon for the next one. Have a good one.